Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. So I recently did a video on the pressure that women face to have kids and how that can be difficult if you have a chronic illness or if you have infertility, that kind of thing. And it reminded me of a thread that I saw on Twitter about disabled people having kids. And I know that within the disability community, there are some people, some pretty hardcore activists that, you know, believe that disabled people or chronically ill people should be able to do whatever non-disabled, non-chronically ill people should, can do. I mean, the question is whether they can physically do it, and I think that's sort of where the frustration lies, and where a lot of there's a lot of conflict and issues that arise. And one of these things is having kids. Um, I remember reading Michael J. Fox's memoir. I think he has two now, but the first one where he talks about his Parkinson's diagnosis. And this was back when he wasn't even very, very severe yet. Obviously, his illness has advanced. But he actually had his, I believe it's his third child, his youngest. They had that child after his diagnosis. So he was already fully diagnosed with Parkinson's disease. And I think him and his wife had this discussion as to whether it was a good idea or not to have this, I believe it was a third child. And he said, why not? Just because I have this condition, yes, I may be disabled and my child will grow up seeing me with this illness, but, I shouldn't stop myself from living life and doing things that, other people are doing just because I have this condition. Now, obviously, we know that Michael J. Fox is very wealthy. So, it made a lot of sense when I read it at the time. I was like, he has a good point. You can't stop your life because you have a condition. He also made the point that he would be able to enjoy his youngest child because his oldest two, he was working a lot. He was very, very famous back in the 80s, the 80s or the 90s. And he was like, what? I was working all the time and I didn't really get to raise my kids. I didn't get to spend time with my kids. I was on the set, he said, and now with this youngest one, I'm going to be home with her. I think it was a girl. I'm going to be home with her all the time. And, I'm going to get to watch her grow up and that kind of thing. I mean, a lot of assumptions are being made there, but he made some very valid points. The difference, that now that I look back on it, is the difference is that he's very wealthy and he has the means to, have in-home childcare as well as in-home care for himself. That way, it's not a burden on his wife to care for his kids, his youngest, and for himself. And as we know, his condition has advanced quite a bit. And this was a while ago. I think his kid is probably already a teenager, maybe an adult at this point. And, there's a lot of debate on social media whether disabled people should be having kids. And of course, the whole eugenics thing, I did do a video on eugenics. Go look at it. I guess that would be considered eugenics, basically restricting whether disabled or chronically ill people have kids, because there is always that chance, especially if you have a genetic disability or even an acquired illness like Lyme disease, there's always that chance that you could pass it on to your children. And there's a lot of disabled people that say, that's eugenics. People hate disabled people and they don't want more disabled people in this world. And, part of me thinks, why would we want more disabled people in this world? Why would we want to see our children suffer the way that we did, right? Have the same challenges that we've had because of our condition. Why would you want that? It almost seems counterintuitive to me, especially these big activists that fight for disability rights and that are constantly calling out ableism and talking about how they can never get accommodations because of their condition and how there's so much discrimination. And then it's like, oh, but we have a right to have kids, and if they're disabled, that's fine. So it's a very strange, and I do see that a lot of disabled people are split on this. So I'm not the only one that has these opinions. You start seeing the comments, and there's people like, why would you want to have a disabled child, knowing what it's like to be disabled? Like, what kind of logic is that? And then there are other people that are like, we have a right to have kids, we have a right to have a family, so on and so forth. Obviously, like I said, Michael J. Fox is wealthy. He has the resources that if he becomes fully disabled to the point where he has to be in a wheelchair or that he needs assistance, he can afford to get assistance for himself and assistance with child care. He can afford both. Most of us can't. There's IHSS, which is, paying one of your family members to be your caregiver or bringing in a caregiver from outside, and that is not 24-hour care. You are qualified for a certain amount of hours per day or per month, and that's what you get, right? Imagine having a child on top of that. Can you care for that child's needs, or can you afford to have somebody care for that child's needs? I know myself, I would not be able to. I won't even babysit. I won't even dog sit. And I've actually talked about how difficult it's been to have an elderly dog. I actually made a video about that recently, and how hard it's been to care for an elderly dog while also being sick and going through medical treatment and all of that. It isn't easy, and that's a dog, an old dog that sleeps most of the day. And I can't afford to pay someone to take care of the dog. I don't have the resources, and it's kind of ridiculous, to be honest. Is it selfish? I do feel, just like people that are not disabled, there are people who are selfish. There are people who are like, I want this. Just like I said in my last video about the pressure to have kids. There's people that have kids just because they see other people having children and because they want what other people have. And there's a lot of disabled people that are the same way. Why can't I have what other non-disabled people have? I'm entitled just as much as they are. I should be able to have that too. And this is where, I'm not saying that disabled people shouldn't have children and that they shouldn't enjoy having a family. But you do have to look at your own situation. Do you have the money? Do you have the resources? Do you have the physical ability to care for a child? That's one thing to think about. And what Michael J. Fox may not be taking into consideration, even though he kind of made the assumption, is will he see his child grow up? Especially this youngest one, who kind of came a little bit later in his life and in his wife's life. He may not make it to, he may not see his child into adulthood. We've seen how his illness has advanced. And again, there are children who are very resilient. Children can be very, very strong, and they can lose a parent and still be okay. But that's not guaranteed. You don't know the outcome. I have a friend who had leukemia, and he had a stem cell transplant, and then he had, I think, graft versus host disease, and then he had to have a lung transplant. And he asked those questions. He was like, should I have a kid? Is it even right for me to have a child? And his wife, they both wanted, kids. Because, even though he got a lung transplant, it's not something permanent. It's not something that's going to last him the rest of his life. He may need another lung transplant at some point. Is it fair to the child? He actually just had his baby, and I believe he's 40 or 41. Is it fair to the child to possibly grow up without one parent? Those are the questions, right? And even if your parent is alive, they may just not be involved. Think about, the children of alcoholic parents or parents that are drug addicts, even though their parent is alive and is still around. And I'm not saying that disabled people are just like drug addicts, but it can be very similar. You can't be as involved with your child. Especially if you have something like chronic fatigue or chronic pain, You're not going to be taking your kid to play at the park. You're not going to be, involved in all of their school activities. This is the harsh reality of having a disability and having children. And I have seen this. I mentioned this in my last video. There were a couple of actually men that I met. We had the same doctor, and they both had Lyme disease, and they were both still working full time, and they had kids. They had young kids. And I actually got to meet some of their kids, and one of them had a pair of twins. And he didn't have the patience. He didn't have the patience for them because he was in pain. He was in pain. He was feeling sick. And I don't blame him because I know what it feels like to be sick like that. Our symptoms were kind of similar. And, I understand that there are a lot of disabled people that desire to have a normal life, or as normal a life as possible. The reality is that we do not have normal lives, and that we may never have normal lives. And to constantly be sort of torturing ourselves over that instead of coming to this sort of calm acceptance is really, it's very painful. And that's what I think, that's what I see when I see this conversation come up, because I've seen it come up multiple times on social media, because I follow some disabled people. I've seen it come up multiple times, and there's people that are just so angry and so upset, and they blame everybody else, and they say, well, the world hates disabled people, that's why we can't have children, because there's a possibility that our children would be disabled. If the society was more accepting of disabled people, it would be okay. But at the same time, it's like, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to risk having a child with a disability? I'm not saying because other people hate the child, because a child is going to struggle, because a child is going to it's going to be tough to get through life for this kid. This is also a huge argument in the pro-life or anti-choice, whatever you want to call it, in that realm. And I remember my mom, my parents are Catholic. We're all Catholic. We were raised Catholic, but my parents are church-going Catholics. And there's this lady that she knows at her church who gave this speech. I don't know why she was giving this speech. She has a daughter who is severely autistic and who has heart problems, multiple surgeries. I mean, I don't think she's verbal. I've never met her. I've met her sister, because her sister is my sister's friend. They know each other. And I've never actually met this girl, but apparently her mom gave this pro-life speech about how she went outside and she saw these roses or something. It was a weird story, and that she took that as a sign to have this child. I don't know if she knew that the child was disabled. I can't remember. But now that the child is here, I mean, she's not a child anymore. She's, I think, a teenager, probably close to being an adult. Now she's sort of using this conversation. It sounds almost like virtue signaling to me. And I remember my mom told me this story, and I just looked at her and I said, that's horrible. Because this girl has been through multiple surgeries. I believe she's wheelchair bound. She's nonverbal. She's severely autistic. I can only imagine what other issues she has. I've never met her, but I know that she's pretty severe on the autism spectrum, and she's had, all the surgeries. And I said, that's horrible. That's a horrible thing, because she can't tell you whether she's in pain. She can't tell you whether she's enjoying life or not. She can't tell you whether she's happy to be here or not. And I speak from the perspective of somebody who's very sick, and I've lost my entire life to this disease, and I'm still alive, and I feel almost like I'm forced to be alive, because I have no other option. And I just think it's horrible. I think it's horrible. And that's when I see these people having this discourse on social media that we should just be totally okay with producing, more and more disabled people, because I deserve it, because I deserve to have a family, and society hates us because we're disabled. So I don't think society hates us because we're disabled. Yes, it's difficult to see a disabled person, and I know that that elicits a lot of feelings in healthy people, but I don't think it's that society hates us. It's it is a bit of a burden on society sometimes, but it's also not pleasant for that person, for that disabled person. I can tell you, as somebody who's disabled, it's not pleasant to live like this. So, I'm very torn, when it comes to this debate. You can't force people, you can't sterilize people. I don't think that that's right, the same way that you shouldn't force them to have children. I don't think either one of those is okay. But I do think that disabled people, sometimes I feel like the disability community lives in this sort of fantasy land where they want the world to be this utopia where, you can just be disabled and live a full life. It's almost like being disabled without being disabled. Like, I'm proud to be disabled, I'm okay with it, but I want to live like a non-disabled person. And it's like, well, then that means that you're not okay with your disability, which is fine. It's fine to not be okay with it. It's fine to not be, disabled and proud. I'm not proud of being disabled. I don't like being disabled, right? But when it extends to someone else, to another being, to another human, you're no longer, once that person is here, you're no longer dealing with yourself, with your own issues. Now they're going to have their own issues. And if they have disabilities, they're going to have to deal with it themselves. As much as you want to protect them and as much as you want them to live a full life, and you're going to try to accommodate them and you're going to try to do everything for them, you can't, because they're an independent person apart from you. And I did speak about my cousin who had a son. He had a heart problem or some kind of a heart defect. He's fine. He's I think like 13 or 14 now. He's going to have, certain issues, I guess, because of the heart thing, but I believe he can live a full life as far as I know. But it took a toll on her. It took a very large toll on her, to the point where she didn't have any other children because of it. So, it can be a traumatizing situation as well for the person that has the disabled child, even if that person is not disabled. It can prevent them and stop them from having other children, because they may not have the resources to take care of one disabled child and other possibly, non-disabled children. And then what happens if you have multiple disabled children, which actually can happen? It's a very touchy subject, but like I said, I feel like we need to live in reality, and we need to face the facts of what it's like to be disabled and be alive and live a life as a disabled person. And it's not pleasant, it's not fun. And I myself, I feel like I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I had a child with a disability. And I know that that sounds bad, but let me explain that. Because I know that I'm sick, and knowing that I'm sick and knowingly having a child, and then having that child be disabled, I don't think that would rest well on my conscience. Now, there are people that have kids, like my cousin, who did not know that she was going to have a disabled child. She was young. She was young when she had her son. She wasn't, out of high risk age, and she was very happy to have her child, and she was very excited, and it turned into a nightmare. It was just this horrible thing, and I believe that she has, she loves her son, but I don't think she wanted to go through that again. I think, you get scared, and I do think it's hard for those parents because they question whether they made the right decision. And then there are some parents that go to the opposite extreme, and they start this virtue signaling. And I think the reason some of these parents virtue signal and they talk about how wonderful it was to have this child, even though this child was disabled, they made the right decision. I think they're trying to convince themselves, and they're trying to make themselves feel better for that decision that they made, because they've seen their child suffer, with multiple surgeries, with all of these issues. And I think they're trying to soothe themselves and tell themselves, it's okay that I did this. And I don't blame these parents, especially if you did not know that you were having a child with a disability. It's not your fault. You didn't know. There's nothing that you could have done to prevent it. But I also think that there is a certain level of acceptance. You can live in denial forever and tell yourself that you did an amazing thing. You can use religion to justify what you did. But I do think that there's a level of acceptance that we all need to have when it comes to this topic. And I'm not saying that disabled people are worth less than anybody else. But again, it is a life of suffering. I hate to break the news to you, but it's a life of suffering and it's not fun. It's not fun to live like this. So that's what I have for you guys. You can leave your opinions in the comments. People are going to have very different opinions on this topic. But I felt that it was worth discussing because, we've had the overturn of Roe versus Wade. We are going to have probably an influx of more disabled children because women can't terminate pregnancies even if they know that their child has a disability. So, we're going to have to prepare ourselves for that. And like I said, I'm not saying it's a horrible thing, but we don't have a very disability-friendly world right now. So thank you for joining me, and I will see you in the next one. Take care.